Okay, I'd like to start my presentation if I could.
Can you hold off for a few while he's presenting? I'm sorry? Can you hold off for a few while he's presenting?
I gotta set up the heavy stuff.
I know, but he's presenting right now. He's already.
I thought you said you were done.
No.
He hasn't started.
Go for it, man.
All right.
Out of your way.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Murphy. My call sign is W6TOM. Spent 29 years working for Pacific Gas and Electric Company's communications department. A small part of my job was handling interference complaints. I retired in 2015, and I'm originally from Massachusetts, so I have close ties to the area, and I come back here several times a year now. I'm visiting my sisters in south of Boston. So anyway, let's see. You think you have RFI issues in your home and you're going to call the utility company. Fine, except that you really need to do your homework. I didn't keep any records when I did this type of work, but you start to notice patterns in any type of troubleshooting. And one thing I noticed was that if you were to group people by the people who put the most complaints in, hams were number one, followed by people with AM radio interference, and then other things after that. But in the cases of the hams, a very significant amount of time, I would find that it wasn't the power line noise, it was something else. Sometimes it was something right in their own home. So it's really advantageous to you to go and do your homework and see, what is that? Oh, so anyway, a couple of things, okay, that I have found in my home. I have this battery tender, and this is what it looks like on the display of my ICOM 756 Pro 2. My washing machine does the same thing. At my sister's home, if she turns on her washer, forget it. I might as well shut the radio off. One of the guys I worked with, he liked to listen to talk radio in his office, and he had to do this so that he would be able to listen to his talk radio because of the RFI he had. Now, the type of equipment that we used was made specifically for finding interference. I used a Model 243 Rfi locator made by a company, Model 242, by a company in Portland, Oregon. This is an excellent piece of equipment. Among the things that this will do is it has manual RF gain. It has a analog S meter. It has a separate volume control, and it also has filters that you can switch in and out so that you can see if what you're looking at has a 60 hertz component. If it has a 60 hertz component, it may be power line arc noise. If it doesn't, then it's something else. And here's another picture of the whole kit. This is a ferrite core antenna. It's rated from, I believe it's 500 kilohertz to 3.5 megahertz, although we swept it. It went up closer to 4. It's very directional. Yes. In other words, it's like the old AM radio antennas that you had. If you didn't have it broadside to the station, you wouldn't hear anything. You go and turn it like this and forget it, which is very useful for finding things that are close in. Now, this is the entire kit here. It also came with this log periodic antenna, which, to tell you the truth, I never used. It was 270 megahertz to 1 gig. I never had anything that was that high in frequency. And here's a better close-up, okay, of your I forget what they call it. I called it a magic wand. But this antenna was really great. It had a preamp in it too. It was fine to use once you got in close to something. Now, I had on my company vehicle a couple of Outbackers. This is one of the shorter ones that I had. I don't remember the models now. I think I have this one and I've used it in my personal vehicle. It works fairly well. And the other one that I had was the one that tuned 160 meters. Now they have a newer model of this device called the Model 243. Here's a picture of it. I never actually used this. I was able to get some information on this from one of the guys that I knew who let me come in and take some photographs after I had retired. I want to go through some of, excuse me. I would like to go through some of the things that I found on some of these calls. Now, in this particular case, the customer was complaining that they had interference on an AM radio station, and this was a very low power AM radio station. I heard the interference immediately when I pulled up in front of their house. It didn't take me very long to find the interference, and here's what I found. Somebody had gone and remodeled the house across the street. This is the termination for their cable TV. Here's a little bit better of a picture. And this is what they did, how they routed the coax. Boy, that's a real work of beauty and art. But that was radiating in the AM broadcast band. I've seen this happen one other time too, where I had a ham that had a complaint. I found it down 2 houses down from him. It was an unterminated cable TV connection. Somebody had cut and they had just walked it out and dropped it next to the pole. Now, there are lots of other things in your home that can go and do the same thing. I had a customer who had a complaint. He was legally blind, but his sight was good enough he could get around his house. What he did for a living was he did RF, he did some type of RF software analysis. And he used his amateur radio, and he had a trapped vertical antenna out in the backyard. And he had very high noise floor. I ended up taking my 242 with the magic wand, walking around his house and unplugging all kinds of equipment that he had there that he used because of his handicap. And we dropped the noise floor significantly. And then I also found some interference that was coming from the utility poles. So, no. Well, okay, from the standpoint of the utility company, the California Public Utilities Commission wants the utility company to fix any interference issues. But if you go out there and you find that it's coming from something else, then once you've determined that, it's really not the utility company's responsibility. I mean, you're in a situation where, okay, you have a high noise floor, you go in there, you maybe eliminate some other things, and you might find some power line arc noise, but it depends on how bad it is, because if it's bad enough, you need to eliminate the real bad noise sources that are close in before you even think about finding any of the other things. So if you have a problem in your home, there's actually a couple of things that I would suggest that you go and do. One of the things would be, you might want to start keeping a record, like what time of the day do you hear it? Is it on during the day? It goes away at night? Might be your neighbor's utility interactive solar system. Does it go away when it's dry for a couple of days? That's a pretty good indicator that it might be arc noise. Where I live in California, we don't get any rain for 6 months. They actually go out and wash insulators on the high voltage lines because they have problems with flashovers when they get a little bit of moisture on them. But that's another pretty good indicator too. If you have a spectral display, or even if you don't, and you start tuning up the band, and let's say you hear birdies every 25 or 30 or 50 or 100 kilohertz, and it's regular, that's a pretty good indication that it's some type of switch mode power supply. Maybe a wall wart. More than once I have seen that type of thing go and cause some real problems. Another thing you can go and do too is you can power your rig up on a battery. And then go to the breaker panel in your house and shut individual circuits off one at a time and see what it does to this noise that you have. Assuming that you find that one of the circuit breakers that you open kills the noise, the other thing you need to be aware of is if you re-energize that piece of equipment, the characteristics of the noise and the frequency that it is on is likely to change until the piece of equipment warms back up. Good example of this was a customer that I went out for a complaint. He had a trap vertical in his backyard. He had very high noise. The noise was on 80 to 10 meters. It was really bad. I went out to the front of his house and I put my equipment on the outbacker antenna on my truck. I could not hear that noise. Now I could go and put it on his antenna. I had no problem hearing it at all. So I went out in his backyard with the ferrite antenna. And what I found was if I walked up to the wall in his backyard, I could hear it real strong. And as I got back away from the wall further and further, it got weaker and weaker. So it kind of indicated that maybe it was on the other side of the wall. And that was a little unusual too, because houses in California usually have wooden fences around them. And this was a cinder block wall that was about 10 feet high. So I started driving around the neighborhood trying to find what was in there. And what I found was it was a AT&T PBX. It was the local PBX for the community, local telephone switch. It was a big piece of land. It was probably 3 or 4 acres with a cinder block building with 2 doors and no windows in it. And they had perimeter lights. They were about 4 foot high and they were on 24/7. And the one that was right opposite the wall of his backyard was radiating everywhere. Just so happens that right after I found that, one of the AT&T techs drove in. I went over and I talked to him, and he got the building maintenance fellow out of the central office. I talked to him. He went in and he turned the breaker off that those lights were on, and the noise went away. So there you go. That's a good example. Now, in another similar situation, I had a customer that had, I don't remember the type of antenna. It was one of these antennas that you can load up on 80 meters. It looks like a tower. I think it's called a high tower. He lived in a mobile home park, so he didn't have a lot of space. He couldn't put a dipole up. He had noise really bad, and he operated primarily on 75 meters. We did the same thing with the battery, but then I also went around his house. First thing I found was he had a little golf cart that he went to go around and ride around in the mobile home park. It was the battery charger that he had the thing on. And then his wife had an internet business. She had various different things in her office that were radiating too. Once we went and we unplugged all of that, we significantly decreased the amount of noise that he had. Let's see, in another case, what I found too was I had a customer that had AM radio interference. Now the thing that was interesting about this was the radio that he had would run off of AC, or you could pull a switch on the back and it would go and connect it to a couple of D-cell batteries. If he ran on the D-cell batteries, he didn't have the interference. But if he went and ran on the AC, it was really, really bad. And again, going around with the ferrite core antenna and the device that I had, I found that the noise was coming from his breaker box. Now, when I would go out on one of these jobs, I would always go and arrange to have a trouble man on call. Now, trouble man, in the parlance of the utility company that I worked for, was a man that worked on secondary stuff. Like, for instance, if you called in and said the lights in your house are blinking, first thing they would do is they would send him out. He drove a truck with a 35-foot boom on it. He was qualified to do hot sticking and work on the AC. He went in there and he tightened everything up in the breaker box. Didn't take the noise away, but it reduced it significantly. Customer's problem was corroded connections. And I don't remember whether I looked to see if he had aluminum wire or not. Another case that I had, and this was a very good one, the fellow that I went out to help and later became a friend of mine, he was a wireless engineer, and he also liked to operate on 40 meters. He had gone and built his own loop antenna. And he had located what he thought was a noise source. He thought it was coming from a street light. Well, it wasn't. It was coming from the garage of a house across the street. I could take my equipment, I could walk up to the garage and turn it all the way down to where I could just barely hear it. Walk back 2 or 3 feet from the garage and noise would go away. And judging from the waveform, it was probably computer equipment that was in the garage. One of the disadvantages when you're looking for RFI is you're using a receiver that has automatic gain control. Automatic gain control is not your friend. One of the things that I would do is if I was going to go search for a noise source in a neighborhood is I would take the device that I had, connect it up to my outbacker antenna, adjust it so that I had an audible noise that I could hear and also an S meter reading that I could read, that I could reference to. S meter in the piece of equipment I had went from 0 to 100, so typically I'd set it at 10 or 15. Sometimes, depending on how strong the signal was, is you'd start the engine up and now you'd hear all the electronic noise in your vehicle. But you drive down the street to the next power pole, you shut the engine off and you look at the analog S meter reading and you see if it's changed. And this is how you go around the neighborhood checking to see if it's coming from a particular pole. And then if I found a pole, I would go and I would call a T-man out. And let me give you okay, here's a typical power pole. And I want to walk out in the front here because I can't do this from the screen. Couple of things on this, okay? First of all, these insulators are called bells. They have a ball joint inside them that's metallic. The bell joint goes and it corrodes. You get an induced voltage on that because that's 12,000 volts. That can go and cause noise. You have mechanical connections. Now, in the old days, they used split bolts and other connections like that. Some of the stuff that they use nowadays, they have compression fittings, some of which are fired with a charge similar to a shotgun shell. This is a mechanical connection. That is. So that's all a possible noise source. What I would do is I would locate the pole. The trouble man, when he came out, he would hot stick it. You go up there with a hot stick and move things around. I would go and listen on my equipment. Sometimes the noise would go away. Sometimes it would change in characteristics, especially if he got the wires swinging. It would actually modulate it. There was another time when I did this where I had been out there one day. The T-man wasn't available. He came out the next day and the noise was gone. He went up there and he touched it with his hot stick and it came back and big time. So it's kind of a little bit of a hit and miss. One thing I should say is don't take your MFJ fiberglass pole and try to replicate this. Would be a good idea. But what you can do is if you pull on the stays that are on the power pole, that'll do the same thing. It will modulate the noise and you'll be able to tell. So that's a way that you could tell on your own. Now, they will replace those bells with, these are called epoxylators. They're a new type of insulator. They've gotten away from, I don't know why they've gotten away from using the bells, but this is what they're using now. Underground utilities, you can still have noise, and it can be power line noise. This type of construction here is common in some of the neighborhoods that were built in the 60s in California. The primary is run overhead. That triangular shaped thing up the top is the actual transformer. Your secondary coming to your house, the 220, runs down inside the pole and underground. Now, I had a customer that I tried to contact the customer. I left messages with him several times. He never returned my calls. Finally got to the point to where my supervisor wanted me to go out and do something on this, so I went out to his house on my own. What I found is I could hear the interference at his meter, and it was very bad, and it was arc noise, judging from the waveform. But if I went and I connected my equipment up to the antenna on my vehicle, I couldn't hear it. Couldn't hear it at all. I placed a call into one of our radio specialists who dealt with this stuff, and he told me to have them come out, the T-man, and have him pull the covers on the splices underneath the sidewalk, and to go and check there. And sure enough, that's what it was. It was the connections where the cables had been spliced. They ended up having to redo those connections. Later on, when I talked to him about that, he told me of a similar case that he had where a woman was complaining of AM radio interference. He had gone out on this one, and what he had found is when you go and you connect aluminum to copper, you have to use a proper connection that's rated for dissimilar metals. They had not used the proper connection, and it had corroded, and it was an excellent rectifier. It was causing the noise that was coming into his house. Now, another type of situation that I've seen a couple of times, and I'll describe this one. This fellow was a professor of electrical engineering at UC Berkeley, and he had bad noise on 40 meters. He had one of these multi-band vertical antennas that have the traps that are off the sides of the antenna. He also had a 40-meter dipole. He did not have that same noise on the 40-meter dipole, nor could I hear this noise on my equipment with my antenna. But what he did have was he was a mile from San Francisco Bay, salt air. He was a half a mile from a major freeway, air pollution. He had a shortwave broadcast station a mile from him and an AM broadcast station several miles away. He had intermod. And I had another customer with a similar complaint. He was in a neighborhood that was all underground utilities. The nearest overhead power line was probably a half a mile from his home. And it was the only thing that he had intermod also. He had the type of antenna that he had, it appeared to be a fan dipole. I don't remember if I asked him what it was or not, but he must have had corroded connections on it because he had the same type of problem. So there's another situation that you can see where you end up with something that is not power line noise. Now, if you're going to go and contact the utility company and go and make a complaint, you're probably going to get a call center. I would just make sure that you give them your name, your address, your contact information so they know who you are, how to contact you when you're around, that you have an amateur radio license, that this is an FCC license, and save all the details for the person that comes out to go and do your call. Now, pardon me. When I went out on a complaint, I would go and call the customer and talk to the customer beforehand. I would ask them a number of questions, like what type of antenna system that they had. When did they notice the noise? Some customers, for instance, if you had a beam, well, you rotate your beam around. If you're hearing on 20 meters, it'd be nice to get an azimuth. If the antenna is pointed at the power pole in front of your house, then yeah, maybe that's where it is. But then if it's pointed at your neighbor's house, maybe he's got a new lawn tractor and he put it on a battery tender. So there's a lot of different possibilities. Oh, and does the nature of the noise change when it's windy? That's another good indicator. One of the complaints that I went out on, we had a connection that connected two circuits, and when the T-man went up there to go and hot stick it, he actually got an arc off of it. It was so loose. They came out, they fixed that the next day because that was service affecting. I had another one where when the T-man went up to look at it, he could hear the connection sizzling from the arc. I couldn't hear that down on the ground. So I don't think I can think that pretty much concludes what I have here to say. Excuse me?
The worst one I had was the light right out front. You could actually see it arcing blue.
Oh, yeah. Depending upon where you live, now this is where I live in California, sometimes the utility company handles the street lights, sometimes it's a local community. In my case, I live in an unincorporated community, it's the county. But if you go to the next city that's incorporated, the city handles it. And I've had people complain. Matter of fact, I had one ham. He was complaining. I talked to my supervisor. They were actually going to let me go out at night and look at this, but he didn't want to call in a complaint to the power company for some reason, and I had to have paperwork to go and do it. So we never went and pursued that. And by the way, does anybody have any questions?
Well, I'm in a very rural part of Vermont, and we have electric fence chargers on a lot of the damn fences. And man, that gets into everything. It's broadband like the old spark transmitter. Any ideas or suggestions other than doing in the cows?
No, although I can tell you a story that you'll probably laugh at a little bit. I went out to do an annual on a radio receiver. I did a D-Sense test. Now, a D-Sense test, okay, is basically a test to see if you have a problem with the sensitivity of your receiver being desensed by interference. Well, I found this receiver was desensed very, very badly, something on the order of 20 dB. And I did not have a spectrum analyzer. I contacted our radio specialist group. This receiver was located in a substation. Whenever I went into the substation, I drove in the same way. I walked up the outside stairs to the second floor and I went in the door. That's where my communications equipment was. So he shows up, I think the next day. We take the spectrum analyzer up there and we connect it up to the antenna. And what do we see? We see a pulse about 30 dB over the ground, over the noise floor that's occurring periodically. He looks at me, he says, that's got to be close around here. So we walk around the back of the substation, we kind of look at each other and start laughing. The 12 kV bus structure, okay, had an electric fence that had been erected around it on fiberglass poles. And they had a strobe on there that every time it was strobed, the strobe would go off. And that was my D-Sense. Apparently the squirrels would like to get in there and frolic on the 12 kV, and once in a while one of them would get between that and ground and have a very short bad day. But yes, I don't know what you would do about that. I'll put a plug in too for a friend of mine, AK6R. He owns Palomar Engineers. He sells a lot of ferrites and other things that can be used for RFI. I have listened to his talk that he gives at the ARRL Southwestern Convention, which is held in February down in Yuma. I've listened to it a couple of times. It's good. He gives a good talk. So anyway, I think that pretty much concludes what I have to say. And again, oh, you never know what you'll find in a communications room up on a mountain. That's a rattlesnake, by the way. One of the guys I work with, he was working at a site, sitting at a computer. He had left the door open. There was a crew working up on the tower. He said he felt a little funny, and he looked over, and here there was this little critter on the shelf. Be aware of your surroundings.
I have a funny story for you. When I first got my license, my parents had a lot of money, so I bought a Collins 75A3, and I was in the middle of New York City, and there was a broadcast station in the middle of New York City that just blanked out the receiver, and I couldn't hear anything with that. So I wrote a note to Collins, and I said, I got this problem. I got a note back from Mr. Collins himself with a little choke. He had wound a coil to tune out that broadcast station for me, and he sent it to me, no charge, and it did reduce the signal strength immensely.
I had a similar problem at my own home. I went to a 450 ohm ladder line fed dipole. I should probably mention that where I live, your typical house lot is 50 by 100. And I wanted a broadband antenna. And I put up this window line fed dipole, and I used a balanced line Pelstar antenna tuner. It worked excellently, except for one little problem. I have an 1100 kilohertz 50 kW radio station about 3 miles from me, and it just wipes the receiver out of my KX3, my IC7300, my KWM2, my 51J4 doesn't mind it at all, nor does my FT818 or some of my other sets. But I ended up having to buy an AM band block filter and put that in series with anything that I was going to use that was sensitive to that.
So Tom, on this light problem I had where I could see it arcing out front,
I
made the call. I called the
Is it the power company that handles the street lights where you live?
Whatever the call was,
Yeah.
the address on the internet, and I did the call.
Okay.
So meantime, while I was waiting for them to come, I'm an experimenter, so I made myself a hybrid nulling. 3 ferrites. I simply attached the ground on my HC outlet as the reference. That's where the noise is strong. And I nulled it out to the point where I could null it out on any given frequency in the HF band with nothing but passive ferrites. And then the truck was at the end, finally. I went down there. I said, oh, thanks for coming, guys. He says, what do you mean? I'm just doing a routine check. We didn't have a call for this. I said, go down 5 poles. He went down 5 poles, changed the light. Power was gone. But I learned how to make a nulling system.
That's interesting. I went over to visit a friend of mine who lives up in the foothills of the Sierras. He's got big 4 or 5 acres, and I was going to play with the antennas up there. It's a little hard to do that with a 50 by 100 yard, especially when you want to put something up for 75 meters. And he had some Costco cheap fluorescent lights, and if he turned one of those things on, forget it. I couldn't use the radio.
This would have worked for that somewhat.
Yeah, well, you could put ferrites on the thing, too.
You had to tune it for every station you're trying to tune in, right?
No. You mean the filter I have?
Yeah. This box I made had the SO239 for the antenna, the SO239 for out the receiver, and SO239 from the noise antenna. In this case, just the ground of the outlet was the noise antenna. So
Yeah.
null out house noise,
Yeah, okay.
as long as it was 60 hertz.
Well, one of my friends had a problem that wiped out his stuff, and what he found out what it was is his neighbor had gotten a closed circuit TV system that he had put to look out in front of his house, and it was powered by a wall wart and had a 30-foot long piece of wire that went to the camera equipment, and that's what was radiating. He replaced the wall wart with a linear power supply, and it was the end of the problem. But I mean, all of this it's just getting worse and worse and worse. I'm fortunate I don't have much of a problem where I live. I think one of the reasons I don't is that the overhead is 4 kV, which is obsolete now, but there's a few areas that have that because where I live, most people don't have air conditioning. So there's not a big air conditioning load in the summertime. But anyway, I think that concludes my presentation here, unless anybody has any questions. Thank you. I'll pull my